welcome to day 2 of this conference. Coming from Singapore, my name is Jack Cho. I just came from Singapore's winter, and I was expecting Melbourne's summer to be even warmer, but I realized I'm still adjusting to the chilly weather, here, and it helps me wake up. I hope everyone has fully recovered from your travels. And also yesterday, I found yesterday's discussion to be quite, heavy duty, like information processing, right? Of course, as I'm trained social scientist, we have to make sure our facts are right, about ADM and Chinese societies, which is something we will continue to do on the second and third day of this wonderful event. But at the same time, after getting our reality check, we also need to be uplifted. We have many humanities, we have practitioners here and online, right? And so I think there will be no better person in the world, as I know, who can help us to get more uplifted, to get our not only the facts but also the ideas and the ideals, right? And that person is right next to me, and Malavika Jayaram, is actually a pillar, I have to say, of our internet digital media research community, not only for Greater China but for the Asia Pacific, because Malavika is the founding executive director of Digital Asia Hub. One of my intellectual homes, for more than 10 years, Malavika has been really the pillar of that community, along with her other wonderful colleagues like Dave Lewis, who will also join us online. And her keynote this morning is titled "Disappearing from Happiness Street and Other Tales of Magic and Wonder." I just love this title. It already, yesterday we actually started from failure as a legal scholar, and also our more of a scholarly way, to talk about the failures. But Malavika's title actually also shows there's the artistic aspect. You look like an artist today to me. And what Malavika will do is that she actually humbly calls it a jam session. So she wants to talk about art projects. So ADM, by the way, is one of the latest reincarnation of technologies. And technologies is not only about getting things done, but also getting emancipation from reality. By this, I don't mean we can just ignore reality, but it's something that can help us transcend our theorization, our consideration in an interdisciplinary, transcend the tyranny of reality, which is crucial if we want to find really long-lasting, sustainable solutions for the problems on the ground. We have to look into the sky, look into the future. So that is what Malavika will be doing, and she invites all of us to join her. And meanwhile, in the program, we do not have Jun Liu and Suisheng Zhao to join us this morning. I think Suisheng is coming, is on his way, right? And but we will still have Nicholas, Loubere from Lund University, and in the room, and Florian Schneider is joining us online from Leiden. But here this morning we will have Rachel again, and Marianne, whom we already met yesterday as the respondent. So without further ado, let's put our hands together for Malavika.
Thank you. Jack, thank you for this very, very overly generous introduction. This is a theory-free and a paper-free session, so you can all relax. If you stayed up a little too late last night, it's not going to get in the way of understanding what's going on. My background is as a lawyer, but as someone who's kind of a fake academic who was a practicing lawyer and then sort of snuck into this world kicking and screaming. I'm less about academic journals and publishing and much more about pictures, because I think they tell better stories. And magic and wonder is something I'm much more interested in than all the other tourist work, because I think these things touch you at a very visceral level, bypassing all of your logic and brain systems. So come along for the ride. We've got a great band here to riff. So let's see what we have here. I'm really interested in art as a way of surfacing really difficult, contested ideas and helping people navigate things they've never quite thought about or have thought about, but not quite in that way. When we were very new in 2016 and we started our first AI in Asia event in Hong Kong, we had an art exhibition. And all the machine learning computer scientist folks were like, is this a typo in the program? Am I really supposed to be at this thing? Because I do machine learning. I don't go to art exhibitions. But after 2 glasses of wine, they were like, oh my God, I've never had to. This is the kind of experience I was hoping we could have here as well. I'm going to play on some of my favorite projects when it comes to surveillance, privacy, different ways that people have of taking back agency, exercising autonomy, different ways of expressing rage against the machine, trying to find hacks, workarounds. So this is in no particular order. It's a very stream of consciousness thing. This is a project called Ad Nauseam, which is by some scholars who I love. So it's Helen Nissenbaum, who many of you privacy lawyers might know, Mission Zeraviv, and Daniel Howe. I see autocorrect has changed mission to mission, very mission-oriented. Okay, so Ad Nauseam is this very cool browser extension where, you know how we're always getting profiled? We're always getting put into little boxes, not of our own construction. Our reality is being constructed by some other algorithm snooping and watching at what we're doing. Ad Nauseam clicks away quietly at all the ads so you don't have to. So it's a time-saving device. And what Ad Nauseam does is by registering your presence on all of these different websites, expressing interest in all kinds of different products that you yourself might actually have zero interest in, it's doing its bit to obfuscate and perturb and mess with the data, right? So I might actually want to look for coffee, but it's also going to look for bourbon and green tea and tampons and COVID tests, right? So it's going to click on all of these things. So good luck to any machine trying to make sense of where your actual interests lie. So this is clicking ad nauseum, pun intended, visiting every single database, every network, and your appetite for data gathering and your interest in ads is so omnivorous that it actually results in so much noise, coming back to yesterday's keynote as well, talking about noise and signal, that it doesn't provide anything relatable or meaningful to anyone trying to monitor and surveil you. So this is one of the experiments where you can you can assert autonomy and agency by limiting the amount of data that's collected, or you can just throw your hands up in the air and go to the other extreme and say, let's throw so much data at this algorithm that it makes no sense to anything. So this is one of those projects. And Helen with Finn Breton has written this wonderful book called Obfuscation, which is all about different theories of protest, which I would highly recommend. This is a project called Platform Sweet Talk, which sort of goes into the ideas of engagement and all the different nudge factors that force us to stay online, optimize our engagement with platforms, incentivize us to spend more and more time because we're so desperate and craving attention and likes and people looking at what we're doing and enjoying it. So this basically anonymizes and depersonalizes this. So all of the so it's basically leaning into notifications. This is a project by Ben Grosser, and it's called Platform Sweet Talk, which I love. And it basically takes this very seductive tactic of notifications, nudging you into spend more and more time, but depersonalizes it to an extent where you don't actually feel incentivized to engage because it's like someone clicked on something you said, or someone liked something. A, B, and C liked X, right? So it basically takes away this personal factor that wants you to stay on a platform and do more and more things. So it messes with this idea of engagement. This is a project by Matthew Cherubini where, we've all heard about the trolley problem till, we never want to hear about it again. But in this project, he talks about ethical autonomous vehicles, and he sort of takes this sort of, any color as long as it's black kind of idea with Ford, and says, what if your ethical predispositions and the ethical constructs that you would like to pick are a choice, just like the color of a car or the hubcaps or whatever other, what kind of leather you want in the car? What if you could pick a particular set of ethical principles that go into your autonomous vehicle so that that decides in difficult situations, different philosophical problems that it encounters? Do you kill the school kid? Do you kill the transvestite? Who do you kill today? It's actually your ideas of ethics and what you feel about different types of people is baked into these types of algorithms. So your car is being driven and shaped by your sort of constructs. So it's an actual game that you can play, which is really cool. This is a really great project by Wei Li, which is she takes 7 years worth of WeChat moments, makes actual index cards and files them in a library, but in reverse chronological order, which is her way of messing with time. And it's almost like the things that you thought have happened are actually going to happen to you next. So in messing with sequential logic and the ways in which timelines work and the way in which threading works, she's sort of perturbing the system to say, what's real? What does time mean? What happened? Does it matter? Does chronology matter? And it's a really, really cool project. She did this at the Goethe Institute, put this in the library and allowed people to check out 7 years worth of her very intimate personal details, and asked herself, saying, was this just a vanity project? Was she just, indulging in this very Borgesian exercise of, messing with the library and the form of data and archives and index cards and notations to see what emerges when other people engage with her personal private life? This is another really great project by Rosalie Yu. I love this title. It's called the Photographic Knitting Club. So she takes digital techniques and thinks of them as craft and as very handmade artisanal exercises and practices. And in this, she brings together a group of people who use photogrammetry, which, as we all know, helps, map spaces. You use it for Google Maps, you use it for survey data, for mapping places. The NSA uses it, all kinds of creepy 3-letter agencies use it. But she wants to engage with this idea of how creepy surveillance is when it comes into the domestic space. So we're using photogrammetry inside the bedroom, inside the living room, inside the bathroom, in these very personal domestic spaces to show the sort of function creep and scope creep and corporate agencies have insight into our very personal lived intimate moments. And then they knit these pieces of data together from this knitting club to actually use these different points. So for example, one person in the knitting club says, there's a spot in my room, which is kind of this black hole that sucks up all my energy. And when I'm really in a bad mood, I just sit there, and that's the place where like the feng shui is really bad. And that's where I have my worst moments. And you're sort of leaning into that space and using that vortex to then connect to other people's moments of despair and anxiety, to then come up with a very new kind of map, which is knitted together of other people's experiences. This is on right now in the M+S Exhibition Center in Hong Kong. This is something that was inspired by role-playing games, which I'm sure a lot of the media and communication scholars here study in great depth. And this is someone who's a Taiwanese American who is trying to play with questions of identity and language, and talking about, using a bilingual conversation where he's using, it's a conversation that basically, it's always an argument. All of Ryan's work deals with arguments and different ways that people converse at cross purposes. But he uses these different blocks and sentences as a role-playing game where you're stuck in this infinite loop where you can never go back. The conversation can only go forward. but he's taking these very Taiwanese ideas, Confucian ideas of filial piety, ideas of, patriarchy, and then smashing them up against very American ideals of, self-preservation, individualism, and seeing where these conversations go in this puzzle, and how difficult it is to retrace steps and what you do when you're in the moment, stuck with the conversations that have predated where you are. And this is something dear to our COVID hearts. This is a project by Lauren Lee McCarthy called Saliva, where she's really disturbed by the idea of very intimate DNA information being handed over to governments and corporations. And she makes this offer of you saying, can I be your human saliva exchange? Can I be the repository for your saliva? And I will not do all the creepy things that companies do. Can we, in a moment of trust, agree to be each other's saliva banks and deal with this very intimate information with all kinds of rules attached to them that other companies don't give you the freedom to do? So these are the terms of exchange, right? Your saliva will not be used for research. It won't be used to determine ancestry, won't be used by insurance providers to create weapons for criminal tracing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end, it will be, you can do what you like with her saliva. So she does a lot of really, really interesting work. And I think this is the one that I felt most spoke to issues of surveillance and the kinds of things we're talking about here. So that was just a very quick canter through some of the kinds of projects that I'm really interested in. Some of them play with notions of time, some with space, different kinds of temporal and spatial realities. But I think they all get to this idea of data not being, Jack mentioned facts. And I think when we think of facts, we forget that so many of them are actually relational. It's about the liminal spaces between facts where relationships are formed and where power structures are embedded. And I think that's something that this conference is very deeply engaged with, about, questions of how automation affects those relationalities, how it perturbs those logics. And so I think those few projects were just little experiments into, just to sort of perturb your own minds and get you into the space of thinking through these art projects with me. So these are the 2 or 3 big projects that I really wanted to spend a little more time on, and then I'd love to hear everyone else's responses. So I know Jack is from Wuhan originally, so this is probably somebody you know and have coffee with when you're there. This project started originally from another project I haven't included here, which was called Black Sutra, where Deng is actually looking at classifieds, actual offline written pieces of paper all across China, where people are making classified requests for things that betray their very innermost desires, looking for prostitutes, looking for tuition, looking for, certain kinds of contraband. And he's very interested in black market exchanges of information and data. And when he started that project looking at classifieds and the different ways and avenues and fora in which classifieds and ads are put out, that led him to actually go and buy a treasure trove of data. So this was the data of 346,000 citizens of Wuhan that he bought for about $800, 500 yuan on QQ. And this is what he did with it. This is an exhibition that he created. These are the actual pieces of data, like each one of those squares, rectangles, represents one of the individuals whose data he bought. So it is illegal. He himself said, I'm fully expecting that I've broken the law and I will be thrown into jail, but I thought it was really important for people to understand what is done with their data. But what he does is he takes these pieces of information, which include name, gender, age, phone number, all the usual kinds of things you would expect, travel itineraries, online shopping records, your vehicle license plate numbers. And this was very easy for him to just buy on QQ. But what he does is he has his assistants, he has volunteers work with this data to very sensitively, in a way that QQ and other online platforms don't do, to redact a lot of the very, very intimate personal information. He also then treats these pieces of paper with a particular kind of ink so that these pieces of data are only visible under particular light, as you can see in this exhibition. So this is what it actually looks like, right? So all of the intimate data is being blanked out, which again is a reflection on what should and doesn't happen with most online platforms. And what they do is they send text messages to these 346,000 people whose data he's bought, saying, would you like to come to this exhibition? You're actually part of it, and you feature in this exhibition. Some people thought, wow, this is really cool, this is really creepy, I want to see what's being done with my data. Other people said, you're really fucking insane, you're crazy, I don't know what you're doing with this information, but they all showed up. So this was his way of saying, I know I'm going to be thrown in jail, but I think it's really important for people to understand the excesses and the egregious ways in which data can so easily be purchased without someone's consent, without them knowing what it's used for. And for all of you who understand anything about European data protection law, or indeed any data protection law, with no concept of consent, data minimization, purpose limitation, accountability, transparency, none of the things that we've grown to love and cherish, none of the human rights associated with data. So this was, of course, shut down in 2 days. The police closed down the exhibition. And then, of course, unperturbed by this, a couple of years later, he goes on to do this other project called A Disappeared Moment. And that's kind of where the title for this keynote comes from. Try and stop a good guy doing cool things. What do you think all of these people are doing here? Any guesses?
Exercising.
Good guess. Anyone else?
Evading security cameras.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're trying to do. So it could be some very cool avant-garde Pina Bausch interpretive dance thing, but it's actually not. He realized that he wanted to find a way to disappear. And he picked a street, and it just so happened that one of the streets that he found that had bazillion cameras, surveillance cameras, CCTV cameras on it, which seemed to mushroom and multiply every time he went back to the street to do research, was ironically called Happiness Street. So his whole project was about a disappeared moment. It's kind of like we know about Cartier-Bresson and photography and the sort of, the decisive moment. This is kind of the reverse of that. Instead of what you freeze and what you choose to include in the frame, it's how you want to be excluded and, extract yourself out of the frame of sight. So he did this himself. He spent 6 months collecting the data, he wrote down the brands, he looked at the cameras, he studied every single angle, looked at their depth of, what they could look at to see where the blind spots were, tried to draw a map of how he could evade the camera. So it's literally like some places he was up against the wall, some places he's crawling on the floor, other places he's sort of scaling the wall Spider-Man-like, doing every kind of contortion to avoid those particular cameras. And then after this research, he thought, there's no use just me doing it on my own and publishing an article. I actually need to make this a performance piece with volunteers sourced on the internet as an interactive experience, as like a tour that they experience with me. So that's this group of people. The youngest was 5 years old, who very triumphantly at the end of this project said, we beat the cameras, we destroyed them. They didn't. And it turned out to be a hell of a lot more difficult than they thought. It was like, it took about an hour to walk a kilometer because of all the contortions they had to perform. This is the sort of scale of the cameras. And as I said, every time he turned up to do some more documentation, like he'd been there a week ago and there were like 5 more cameras that weren't on his map. So these are the people trying to sort of, evade them in particular ways. And this is one of his drawings, very, very detailed, beautiful architectural drawings of all the ways in which you need to avoid the cameras, where they're located. And I wish Ellie were here. She would love this. At the end of this disappeared moment, images from it, because this project was banned. You won't find it anywhere on Chinese media anymore. This now exists as an NFT. So you can buy a snapshot of a disappeared moment as a single snapshot in time for 9.9 ETH, Ethereum. This image keeps changing, so there are many different images you can buy. Again, I think it's a really, really clever, very existential take on a moment that disappeared, but did it? Is it frozen? Is it captured? How does this live? What sort of liminal space does it occupy? And what extent do you have to go to disappear? It turns out none of them could actually disappear. So their goal shifted along the way, which was we're not going to evade the cameras. We're not going to escape being captured. All we can aim for is that our faces are not captured. We'll at least try and have our faces not visible to these cameras. The rest of our bodies, you know, one toe, one arm is somehow going to feature. We can't completely escape. And these are a couple of projects that I'll go through very quickly because last time I was here, Haiqing really liked these projects. These are by a friend, Tara Kelton, and these are not about China and they're not by someone Asian, but she engages with a lot of the questions that I think are very universal. And I think Jack will love this given his work on gig work and labor and platform economies. So Tara Kelton is an Indian-American artist who works out of Bangalore. And this is trying to show the sort of invisible labor and the sort of emotional labor and the hidden lives and aspiration and dreams of people who are treated as just, you know, somewhere along the production line, they're sort of assembly line workers who are not supposed to have any ideas of their own. And this is Tara trying to say, I want to show the humanity of the people behind the clicks and the outsourcing and the, you know, the data deluge that they operate under. So she interviewed all these Uber drivers in Bangalore, wanting them to visualize what sort of company they work for, right? Saying, these are people who are so far away, so disenfranchised, so far away from the center of power, from where the algorithm is created, from where decisions are made, that she says, what kind of company do you think you work for? What does it look like? Can you visualize it? Who runs it? What does the CEO look like? And then she used local photo studios with all the aesthetic baggage that come with them in Bangalore to visualize these descriptions based on what these people, you know, the textual descriptions that they provided. So hold on to your seats. This is what one of the drivers thought Uber looks like. Here's another one, the complaints desk and the help desk, very evangelical looking, or maybe they're in an Oxford Union debate with flowers in the background, all watched over with machines of loving grace. So this is Uber, right? This is what in their imagination sitting in Bangalore, India, Silicon Valley, this is how far removed from their daily lived experience that they think this company is. This is their sort of utopia and dystopia of Silicon Valley. Here's the CEO, not that different from the creep that actually runs it. So this is her way of sort of saying, these are the humans that are implicated in this surveillance platform that you built. But when you actually ask them to visualize and give some sort of humanity and color and texture to it, what do you end up with? And, you know, showing that these are real people who also have ideas and imagination and creativity. And this is the final thing that I'll end with, where this is, again, Tara playing with people. So she pays people. She goes to these mechanical Turkers online, and she uses this two-step process. She gives them textual descriptions. She gives them an image, right? She asks them to describe a very, very famous painting, very factually, saying, someone else is going to render this painting, so can you describe it in as much detail as you can? And then those descriptions get given to other people to create, 3D rendering studios in Bangalore. And these are the very lush images that they produced. So this is one of the images that was produced, one of the 3D renderings. This is another one. Anyone who wasn't here last year who can take a guess at what kind of, any guess for which artist this might be that is being depicted here, whose artwork might we be trying to get at? This one? No? really weird ChatGPT style imagery. But so these are the kinds of, descriptions, very, very literal, some of them. Wooden table, 2 plates, larger than the other, picture on it, blah, blah, blah. This is someone who really took this task very seriously and wrote a college essay on this, which even my students wouldn't do. Very, very rich detail. Shorter ones. And this is the actual picture that she had given them in the first place. So this is Cézanne's Still Life with Curtain. But this is what, when it gets transmogrified to 2 levels of translation, this is what you end up with. So I'm just going to stop here by saying that I think a lot of these projects are really, really creative, critical ways to look at how people are protesting against the ways in which they are either inserted into pictures and images and futures that they don't want to be part of, that they never want to be implicated in. And on the converse, people who are trying ways to reinsert themselves and their own identities and ideas into worlds that actually don't include them, that they are so far removed from, and that pretend that they're completely invisible. So I think a lot of these projects deal with notions of surveillance, of surveillance, of messing with the algorithm in different ways. And so this was just a set of provocations to talk about ideas of privacy and surveillance, and how the Chinese internet, how Chinese tools, technologies, and internet infrastructure have permeated a lot of our consciousness, and the ways in which people are using creative artistic projects to protest about the role of these devices and tools in our lives in ways that we probably couldn't quite grasp in more standard academic practices. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malavika. So we will have how much time we have for the jam session altogether? It's we have 40 minutes, so that's plenty of time. Yeah, this is really I was expecting, to learn a lot cool things, from Malavika. I had very high expectation, but I have to say, with her sharing of, I think that I counted, we have 9 artists, right, or artist groups, and she shared 12 projects, of which I only know 1. All right, so even though I had very high expectations, but you have far exceeded. So I'm very grateful. So without further, let's just follow the order. And I hope Florian can join us online. He's there. Okay. Florian, why don't we go? What is the time over there?
It's just almost midnight here. Can you hear me all right?
Let you go first.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, then I'll go first. Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I always love to see these fantastic art projects. I myself, I don't work on avant-garde art, though I do have some experience with grassroots, bottom-up initiatives, particularly either demonstrations, protest movements, or activism of various kinds. I was reminded, listening to your talk and also thinking about some of the questions that we circulated beforehand, of some of the things that I've been able to study in Taiwan, where I spent some time in 2019, just before the pandemic, to figure out how people were dealing with attempts to increase democratic processes through digital tools. And one of the things that I found really quite interesting is how much the hacker collective GovZero that some of you might know of, so G0V, how much that hacker collective was integrated into sort of a network of NGOs, companies, and the state in order to produce often very hands-on practical solutions for day-to-day issues with data, with participation, and in some cases with the sort of topics that we are now all concerned with, like disinformation, misinformation. And I was reminded of the sort of the intersection between that activism and how it, I think, already slides a little bit into artistic concerns, similar to what you've shown us, when it comes to, for example, how ministries now using this knowledge and the advice from societal actors are doing a different, taking a different approach towards disinformation. I'm sorry, Jack, I couldn't here, sadly, for technical reasons, what you said at the beginning about factuality. So I hope this connects. But one of the realizations that has come out of this attempt to work differently against mis and disinformation is that it's not about the factuality. I mean, you can do a whole lot of fact checking, but that's not going to solve the problem, because people share misinformation for all sorts of reasons: identity reasons, relational reasons, emotional reasons. So one of the conclusions was the best way to go is to appeal to other emotions than anger and frustration and the sort of things that fuel the attention economy, and to do so through humor, and specifically through self-deprecating humor. So every ministry has the job now to release a meme if they come across misinformation or disinformation in their realm within 24 hours, which is supposed to in some way poke fun at themselves to unhinge the perception that something really fundamentally is off. So basically what happens is, to give an example that Audrey Tang circulates quite a lot, the cyber minister of Taiwan, when it comes to these issues, and that I very much like, of a case for the health ministry was charged by online citizens who were misinformed that the ministry was pulling hair products for doing your hair, and that was not true. And it was a bit of a sort of right-wing attack on the DPP government. And the way that the ministry handled that was to have the minister, who was bald, on a picture and say, here, this is what I looked like when I was in my 20s, I have full hair. And so I know what it's like to have hair, and I've lost all mine, so I'm not going to do that to you. So that's basically sort of a way of saying, look at me, the minister, I can joke about myself. And the rationale is that once people laugh about or find something like this silly, it's very difficult to get angry, and it's very difficult to sort of get these viral movements that facilitate disinformation and misinformation flows. So that's just one example that I wanted to share in terms of how these public-private collaborations work in Taiwan. I did want to leave us off with one point on activism, because everything we've now seen and talked about in my example as well are all progressive examples, what we would maybe here call left-leaning. But when you look at China, where there's also a lot of that kind of activism, of course, one of the groundswell activism initiatives is what we would call right-wing in Europe or Australia, but which in China is, of course, far left, nationalistic trolls who are not necessarily bought by the government and who are not a single group of actors either, and often they get in each other's hair over all sorts of issues of whether to be happy about Xi Jinping's term extension or not, for example, but who use very similar tactics as the left-wing progressive online activists, and also when it comes to art. And we know this with the propaganda art that's been churned out by some artists that are now increasingly close to the CCP and tell similar narratives and stories. And we've seen more of that in the wake of COVID. So just a note for those of us doing research on these kind of initiatives to not be blindsided by the maybe underdog initiative to say we want to associate ourselves with our own political ideologies and biases, but to also look at the folks who are doing often quite sinister, hateful things with very similar techniques and tools. And maybe that's something we can talk about a little bit more. I think that I've taken up 5 minutes or so. So I'll stop here, but looking forward to discussing this more.
Thank you, Florian. Really interesting sharing. The first, I think echoes what Malavika said, but you put it in a more explicit, ways to say we need to unhinge. Okay, I think maybe, as social scientists, or a lot of humanities scholars, we are too drawn in, to the study of ADM, and then we become part of the automata. Okay, so it is really this is an excellent way to put it, to something that goes across all the examples, is to unhinge ourselves in a way to echo the Luddites, okay, of the Industrial Revolution that are still active now in Wuhan happiness. So that happiness street is in Wuhan. Yes. Okay, in my hometown, I didn't even know. That's why I didn't grow up very happily. and also in ether, all right? Mm-hmm. And but another really important thing I appreciate from Florian is that Taiwan. Okay, well, yesterday so much is only about mainland China, but the theme of the conference is Chinese societies in the plural. Okay, so it's really important to think about varieties of Chinese societies. So next, should we invite Rachel? Yeah.
So I want to start by saying thank you so much, Malavika. I've used your work in teaching before. Speak up, speak loudly. Say thank you again to Malavika very loudly. I've used Malavika's work in my teaching on the digital state, as I mentioned yesterday. My students get so much out of your presentations in particular. But clearly some of the magic and wonder that you practice in academia with has also traveled into my institution. And when I saw the prompts that you gave this jam session, I also decided I would share some images because in the past 5 years in my institution in Denmark, we've been doing quite participatory, creative forms of response to data protection and to what data is. And the best way to communicate those both to you and to the room is through images. So this first image that I've shared is a party. It's a celebration party for the launch of the General Data Protection Regulation. So on the 25th of May 2018, GDPR came into force in Europe, and it had been in the works. It had been in preparation since 2016. And it just so happened that we were having an academic conference on the 25th and 26th of May that year. And so we had a lot of colleagues who were around in the building, and in this room, which used to be a photocopy room, we decided that we would print out the whole regulation, put it up on the wall. And in the spirit that Malavika also embodies, we would give people beers and we would invite them to approach the wall with a big black pen. And what we invited them to do was make an erasure poem. I don't know if any of you are familiar with erasure poetry as a format, but it's a format of protest poetry primarily. And what it can do is take away the majority of the words and leave something, leave a trace, leave a commentary in the words that are already in the text that remain once you've taken everything else away. And I first encountered it in the work of Sarah Howe, who is a Hong Kong-born British poet. And in 2014, she was visiting the Radcliffe Institute in Harvard, and she gave a talk about a planned poem that I don't know has materialized, but she called it Two Systems. And what she envisaged was taking the basic law of Hong Kong, which talks about this two systems in Hong Kong. And she envisaged giving people in the public Tipp-Ex, sort of whiteout fluid for Americans, and imagining the, quote, glorious undersongs that would emerge from people's capacity to remove the majority of the text and leave only these commentaries. And of course, I work at an IT university, so I work amongst computer scientists, and their response was very much, as Malavika described, we don't do poetry, we write code. Some of them could see that writing code can often be writing poetry. But this was a world that we invited them into, and marvelous things came out of it. So if we could see some more of the pictures. Oh, clicker. Yeah. So we selected, we had to be selective as not everybody was entirely polite in the poems that they made. And we also took the event into a more public domain. This is a tech fest in the city of Copenhagen, where we printed out GDPR in multiple languages, and it was a big erasure poetry party. We offered them more techniques, more than just the blackout pen, scissors and glitter and stickers and stuff. And these were displayed in public in a very fashionable container, which made us look really cool. And this was also something that, as academics practicing, was very new ground for us. We were not used to bringing these conversations into such public spaces. But what came out with these two collections of erasure poems, the one on the left was from the first original party, And it was mostly the academics' anonymized poems. And the second was ones that we curated from the public version. And the second one was called Speaking Back to GDPR, because there is a critical dimension to a lot of the poems in that what the commentary was sure, this regulation conveys new rights upon us. We have new rights under GDPR. Fantastic. What on earth are they? GDPR is written in what people encountered as a highly inaccessible language, and there was almost no communication about how their rights as a data subject had changed. So there was a kind of commentary dimension that people's poems were incorporating. So one of them, very simple, circling words that they wanted to include. And when we published them, we did it so that the material artifact of the regulation was on the left, and then we extracted the poem without the surrounding text on the right, because some of them were not so easy to read. Some of them were very aesthetically striking. This one looks a bit like a digestive system, and it's all about best practices. So it just highlights best practices, best practices, best practices. And the wonderful thing about legal documentation is that it has a lot of repetition. It has a lot of things that you can play with. And this one I found particularly striking for the energy in the erasure. You know, people are really taking out what is supposed to be there and just leaving this commentary on minimization. So not by design at all. People ended up creating poems that encapsulated core concepts within GDPR. And I thought that this would be a really nice project to bring into conversation with Malavika's presentation, because the beauty of ADM is that it also is a sphere in which there's a vast amount of documentation generated. It might be legal, it might be policy, it might be public commentary, but it really does lend itself to a technique such as erasure poetry. The second one I wanted to talk about was actually a physical installation that we had at the same time, and it was called the Compliance Bubble. I genuinely do not remember how or why we had an inflatable bubble in the university. This is a picture on the left is our atrium. But it was again during this same conference in May 2018. And we inflated the bubble and put a sofa inside. And there was also a wireless speaker through which we were playing a computer reciting the GDPR to a background of sort of meditative music. Right? And in order to enter this space of compliance, you had to delete something, because one of the newly conferred rights through GDPR was the right to be forgotten. So we were thinking within our research community about deletion of data, where it goes, what happens to it, how you exercise that right to be forgotten. So to enter the bubble, you had to write something down on a piece of paper and put it into a black box. And for some time afterwards, actually several years afterwards, this black box into which people had put something that they had deleted, a trace of what they had deleted, lived in our lab. And we could not decide as a research community what to do with it. We couldn't decide whether it was data. We couldn't decide whether it was something we could look at. We couldn't decide whether we were going to ritually burn it. We couldn't decide what to do with it. And so these conversations ended up being transcribed as a kind of role play, turning into an academic article about not opening the black box. And this one I drew out because I think a lot of us feel that perhaps art projects are something other people do, and they don't necessarily have a direct connection with our academic publishing or articles that we might write. But this was a really good example led by my colleague Marissa Cohn, who is sort of more closely connected to the HCI community than I am. And she said, well, of course, this is an article. Of course, people are going to have their thoughts provoked by this. They might think about questions of data and deletion differently as a result of reading this. So I thought that was a fun one to share. And the final one, in response to one of the prompts, was, well, how do people resist differently? And in Denmark, there's an agency for digitalization, which I'm sure also publishes material on automated decision-making. But there's a response organization, which takes a lot of the aesthetics of the digitalization agency. As you can see, it's a sort of borrowed shape of the website, not a perfect copy. And it takes its own hammer as a logo, and it's called the Analog Agency. And well, the slogan of the digitalization agency is because the everyday is digital. And the response is because every day doesn't have to be digital. Every day, in fact, is analog. So the first two examples were sort of academic-led art projects, and this is a more imitative institutional response that I think is really interesting, that in the context of automated decision-making, would be really interesting to think through what kind of mirror image institutions could be made to exist either in seriousness or in jest as a way of considering how institutions further, deliberately or not, the interests that ADM coalesces and brings together. So those were some of the images I wanted to share in response to the prompts. And hopefully they have conveyed better than I could in words what erasure poetry and physical installations of bubbles in atriums could do within the context of academic practice.
I was just going to say, maybe because nobody here knows what the prompts are,
Yes.
maybe just a minute on that. Like they were waiting for slides and I said, you don't need to read anything because there's nothing in there. They're just pictures. But what I invited them to do with Jack sort of steering us as the leader of the band was to think about other art projects in their own fields and disciplines to sort of supplement what I was doing. And I particularly asked them to think about things that fell outside of the law, policy, academia kind of bubbles, since you brought up bubble, and to think about what they bring to the conversation, how they help to amplify and extend some of these ideas, and what's the virtue or the value in these other sort of ways to surface these ideas and just engage with those. So those are not exactly the prompts I gave, but just in that space.
Yeah, thank you very much, both. I mean, this has been really wonderful to see all of this. And I mean, I'll be a bit shorter. I think what I was thinking about when I was listening to your presentation and then kind of reinforcing this, and it's something that a few of us were talking about outside yesterday too, is the idea of surveillance not being new, actually, right? And it seems like we always feel like it's something that's happening to us right now, and it's like almost on the brink of becoming something so overpowering and so all-encompassing. But this kind of masks the fact that surveillance is an inherent part of human societies, and it's been something that we've been going through since forever, right? And there's these long legacies of resistance to this in many different ways, right? So just a story that came to mind, I mean, I don't even know if it's a true story. It's one of these kind of mythological tales if we're talking about facts, but I've heard it on a number of occasions in the early 20th century in San Francisco during the period of Chinese exclusion, when Chinese people couldn't become citizens of the United States, right? And the birth records were all in the official record-keeping office in San Francisco, but then there was a San Francisco fire. So all the records were lost, and then everyone says, well, of course I was born here, and there was no way to prove this anymore. So the data was just suddenly, overnight, gone, and the ability to surveil and to control people with that data was gone. And I mean, this is not really, it is an act of resistance, but it's like an act of resistance that was only able to come into existence because something else happened, right? It was like a natural disaster or something of that nature. So, I mean, and I think there are so many examples like this, where if we look back through history, people have responded to attempts to be categorized, attempts to be sorted and placed into different boxes, and then to be controlled through that, or to be repressed through that in different ways. So the question I would just leave you with for the rest of the discussion is, do any of these projects kind of specifically situate themselves in these longer histories of resistance? And if they do, how do they do so?
Please, Mary.
Okay, I go before. Obviously the rookie in this band, someone who has not worked with art or data protection in particular a lot. I'm just going to share some very brief thoughts. So thanks first for this very interesting presentation. It was really cool to look at all these art projects, and I wish there was some way to experience some of them in their exhibition, but apparently many of them are not presented anymore. And maybe I'll start by trying to take this to China and some of the things we have learned yesterday. A first thought, I think, was when you were showing the Happiness Street project, like walking through the city from blind spot to blind spot, trying to evade the cameras. I was wondering whether all these cameras, where all this data goes, where all this footage goes, because all these cameras, are they all set up by the same office, by the same entity, and does all this footage end up on the same desk at the end, or are these maybe different people with different actors with different interests? And that's a thought that kind of kept me, or like at least I found very interesting to follow through the rest of the projects. Are these surveillors? Who are they? What are the different interests behind them? And I think that's also something we really learned from studying the social credit system, which many of us do, or had a look at least, that actually with this whole big range of different people surveilling, or different entities surveilling us, there's also a huge range of different backgrounds and interests in surveillance. And one of the big example stories from social credit, for example, would be this first pilot project of personal social credit scoring, commercial personal social credit scoring, that started in 2015 when the government, or the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, allowed five and later more big data companies to start pilot projects like Sesame Credit, for example, and to start to work on personal credit scores and take on all the information they have in their huge data universe to kind of build these personal credit scoring systems. And the experiment was shut down 2 years after because the state, because of different reasons. But one of the things that were mentioned by the government was that they had obviously very, very different interests in building these credit profiles, and what they did with it then the state was hoping they would have. So loyalty, or like trustworthiness or creditworthiness in the Sesame Credit world, for example, would be loyalty to the whole Alibaba shopping universe. If you bought more expensive stuff, your credit score would go up. And that's obviously not the thing the government had in mind with that social credit pilot project. So it's a very interesting development that started from there, including now all these big data companies that piloted these programs now being put together under one quasi SOE that is now at least majority-wise controlled by the government. And now sort of all these companies are being forced to share the data together. And it's an interesting development. And I think it really just shows and how wide apart these different interests lie when it comes to surveillance. So that was something I thought. And also when we talk about, you mentioned a little bit like messing with the algorithm and these things. And I think it's really, the algorithm itself doesn't care being messed with. It won't even be able to tell apart probably whether it's being messed with or not, right? It always needs interests behind it, or some purpose or some idea in order to be able to say, okay, this is clearly being messed with. This is not how it's supposed to go. I think you just following down the same idea. You're mentioning, or like at least in your abstract, you use the term rage against the machine. And I found it very interesting because, especially in China, where we have this very highly compartmentalized internet environment, who's playing, like how far is it possible to play the machine or use the machine or channel in your own interests and purposes and make sure the machine works for you. And that also, to me, resonated a lot with Deng Yufeng's project that you pointed out, like where he pulled all that data together. That was the one, I forgot the name. You called it. There was the one in Wuhan with the citizens. Yeah. So like pulling all this data together. And I was wondering, he had this particular idea as an artist. He wanted to show that it's possible and how easy it is to get to all the data and show different things as well. And I was wondering, this is this is a particular interest, and I was wondering what other interests would there be to have like very, very to have this very comprehensive data set and what to do with it. And and also I wanted to ask curiously what happened to him afterwards. Did he get into jail, or did they just have tea with him? Or
he wasn't allowed to leave Wuhan.
Sorry?
He wasn't allowed to leave Wuhan.
Okay. Yeah. Until today, he's not allowed.
I'm not sure about until today, but when these projects were happening, until 2018, he wasn't.
Yeah. that's it from my side. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you Marian. I never consider myself artistic, but collecting all these examples make me start to think maybe one day I can put together a course about technology and art. Maybe that's just my Chinese dream. And so let me add more to this already fantastic artistic stew, okay, of wonderful projects. I shared last night in the email, one of my favorite projects was on my last trip to Taichung before the pandemic. It was in the 国立美术馆, okay, in the National Gallery in Taichung. It's a 360 like a cinema, okay, but it's by a Taiwanese artist, Xu Jiawei, collaborating with a Singaporean artist, Hou Zinian. And the title is The Strangers from Beyond the Mountain and the Sea. What I loved it was that it used James C. Scott, okay, but then talking about Southeast Asia, Zhou, if you are familiar with the humanities literature, these are people who evade the state and create their own social, maintain their own social systems. Right? In a way, this is the Southeast Asian equivalent of the Luddites. By the way, the Luddites, they do not just say no to technology, to smash the machinery. If you read Peter Linebaugh, which I think wrote the best history about Luddism, is that they create their own elaborate social system. Okay, it's not just to return to the old way, agrarian old way of life. They recreate their resistance network. So this is the equivalence that we see about like cryptocurrency mining. Okay, at the border, southeast between China, Vietnam, Laos. Okay, and then the so-called the cloud, the so-called all this kind of AI. Okay, smart contract. All these things actually have their material footprints. So we think they come from ether, but they come from Mother Earth. And they never really completely leave Mother Earth with the pollution, with the energy, consumption. So their materialistic footprints on the natural environment and the social environment. So the title is The Strangers from Beyond Mountain and the Sea. The strangers, many of them are migrant workers who do not, because of their mobility status, they lost their social and legal status. Okay, so they are treated as subhumans. So that's one project about the materiality and the social environmental costs of ADM. Okay, in the not just China but the Southeast Asian area. And second, it's actually a book that won science fiction, I forgot the Science Fiction Studies Association Best Book of the Year by Liu Xiao, okay, called Information Fantasies, about Chinese embracing of cybernetics, okay, and advertising industry and mass media, and Chen Xuesen's somatic science. We'll learn more about Chen Xuesen, okay, in the 1980s, in the first post-socialist decade after Mao. So Information Fantasies, check it out. And the third example I want to share here is Wang Lixiong, okay, who is achieved environmentalist, but turned into an NGO organizer, but now one of the dissidents, okay, still living in Beijing. He has a book as a science fiction called 大典. Sorry, this one does not have a 大典, means big celebration. All right, and the book was timed to be, it was a science fiction supposed to be published in the 19th Party Congress around the time, but it couldn't, he was trying to get his book published in Hong Kong, but Hong Kong nobody was willing, so it got the 大典 actually got published in Taiwan. It starts with a chapter about Internet of Shoes. Okay, not Internet of Things. Every single shoe in China now has a code, right? And then the secret police can trace every single shoe. They know who is with who. and they can look at the position and know they're having an extramarital affair, all these kind of things. But except the most important shoes in China, okay, you know who that guy is. Okay, and then the shoes number were only the okay, so I won't tell you everything, but it's like yeah, I'm not. Something happened. Okay, China become democracy. Okay, because of these data points of the most the shoes of the emperor became known to someone else, and then that's the beginning of the science fiction, right? And so read it if you read Chinese. Sorry, I try to get renowned translator to translate into English, but I think he does not want to take the political risk. Right? But it's still a great science fiction in Chinese. And my last example is actually one person, Xiang Fan. Anyone heard Xiang Fan in Tsinghua University, Fine Art? You know, you should check her out. Xiang is 方向的向, Fan is 一帆风顺. Yeah. So this she does data visualization. She used history. She did a lot of award winning. All right. For example, she traced the most important fine art, like oil painting, like a nationwide competition, and she visualized it, and she traced the artists. They came from the like people who after in the 1980s, they were the young generation in the 1980s. It's the same cohort of guys who write paintings about Chairman Mao and the revolutionary, and they keep winning the same prize, the best prize, right? Like 3 decades, 4 decades later, the young generation, you know, in the 80s now become all the same group of guys, and the only thing is that their painting become bigger and bigger. It's like if we have an oil painting version of ChatGPT, it's exactly the same automaton that keep winning the most important prize with the same long march kind of paintings, okay, in China. And another one, I hope she would do it again, is for the Spring Festival Gala. Like this year, like the discussion about the Chinese New Year, CCTV, Spring Festival Gala being the least politicized. You know, she used, you know, TV is a moving picture, right? She used
the colors from
exactly. So
decades of the TV program.
Yeah, so you have a whole evening of the CCTV program. You can see in the huge wall to see this year is more blue, next year is more pink, and next year is deep blue. All right, so to see all every single. So this year, I'm curious. So it's like there are a lot of cool things if we can use digital technology, but without forgetting about history. So you know, so that's another way I would say academics. I'm speaking this also. I understand some of the audience or maybe people online are students who are still considering, do I really want to become an academic? I think from Rachel's point too, is like academics or like Xiang Fan's work, it will show academics are not only people dry like me, like eggheads, okay, and they can be naughty, they can be rebels as well. Thank you. So that's my
thank you. I think there's also this other wonderful project that she does where she takes these images and creates like digital tapestries, as she calls them. And there's one where she's got, you know, you have all the selfies of people in Tiananmen Square, and she's mapped it for like years and years, every single day, all the selfies taken and uploaded online. And then how on the anniversary, there's like a gap, there's a hole in the tapestry because nobody's taking selfies on that date. So how every year there's all of this imagery, all of these colors, and then there's this one hole here, and then again to the next year and there's a hole. So she has these really cool ways of dealing with gaps in the data, the holes which tell you more than the presence of information and artifacts do. Yeah, she showed her work at MIT a few years ago, many years ago, actually 10 years ago. It was really, really, really moving. Very beautiful.
Yes, yeah. By my understanding, she, at least to my limited knowledge, okay, she's my most favorite digital artist.
Yeah.
You know, dealing with social issues in China now. Yes, there's a question or comments. Can we get a microphone?
I might just add, we were talking about exhibitions and not being able to attend them, but there is a exhibition at the Australian Centre of contemporary art. It's peripherally related to ADM+S on data relations. So it's a workshop. I mean, it's not a workshop. Sorry, it's a relatively small space, but it's quite interesting. And Mark Andreevich, who's doing the keynote tomorrow, helped to with part of it on machine listening, and they're mainly Melbourneian artists. So
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mark is going to join us tomorrow, I heard.
Yeah.
Yes, Roger, sorry, didn't see you.
Thank you very much, everyone, and particularly Malavika for this jam session. And it wouldn't be a proper jam session without, as you know, every single song turning into Queen's greatest hits. So my question is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? And what I mean with that question is that I find it very interesting how you and also the examples from Rachel sort of go over very interesting ways in which we essentially storytelling as a form of copium, as a palliative device to deal with a world that is changing, that we cannot understand fully or that we cannot control fully. It gives us back agency. But I have a hunch that for for a couple of years, I found that at least half of my job was to, point out that that was what we're doing in popular media and in our conversations with the Chinese social credit system. It was storified, it was Orwellian, it was this, episode of Black Mirror. And I would then, and I had to sort of spell out to them that, as the undergraduate essay says, since the beginning of time, humanity has essentially told fairy tales as copium, as devices to deal with a world that we couldn't control and understand. And once upon a time, that was the big bad wolf. And now it is China, a country which we cannot understand because it doesn't comply with our intellectual expectations, and technology, which doesn't quite comply with our intellectual expectations. So my question would be, how do we sort of connect, the art, which is very clearly art, with that artistic function, with the copium that we use to sort of navigate this everyday world where factual accuracy actually matters? How do these worlds sort of interact, interchange, and how can we make sure that where factuality is needed, it is present, while at the same time we fulfill this essentially human function of coping?
Yeah, I think there's actually, it's sort of tangential, but I forget who did this, but someone actually took exactly that starting point about how particularly Western depictions of the social credit system had already made their mind up about what they were going to see before they saw it, and how they were very pejorative narratives that were being spelt out and a certain kind of othering that was happening. Oh, this would never happen, in Germany or in America, even though of course it was, because part of the reason the social credit system and Aadhaar in India and other kinds of quantification techniques exist is to provide credit rating systems where they didn't exist, whereas in the US you've had them for decades, right? So I think these sort of Black Mirror episodes, and someone even wrote an article saying, please, can we never use Black Mirror to talk about social credit ever again? Please, can we just have a moratorium on it? And there's an art project that actually takes all the words, the memes, the stories, actually does like a data analysis of all the tropes that exist in the literature and the ways that social credit is described, and debunks all of them. I forget who did that, but it's a really cool project. But I think, I'm sure others have more to say about it, but I think on the sort of relational thing you're asking, I think many of these art projects are not a substitute, but I think they're really good. They're either a proxy for some of the issues, or they're a really, really good gateway drug to looking at it in more depth. I think they're a great entry point to have the conversation. And I think because some of them shock, or they're very visceral, or they're very uncomfortable, allowing you to sit with that discomfort in a space, I think is very different from reading about it. And I think that for me, that's where the magic and wonder comes in, where you're experiencing these systems and projects rather than just reading about them as something happening to someone else. And I think that immersive element is what I like. And I think it's a complement to all of the rigorous fact-based work that we do. And I don't think one is a substitute for the other.
I would agree but one is not a substitute for the other. I think there's an important distinction between storytelling and copium. And in the question, in a sense, I hear an underlying legal mind of what is it that changes as a result of these interventions. I don't think it always has to be something that you can point to and said, well, this exhibition caused that. In our case, particularly with the Erasure poetry, there were questions institutionally about what on earth are you doing? And particularly since we're not humanities scholars and none of us are particularly knowledgeable about poetry in itself. But unlike its namesake, this form of copium was intended to generate new clarity. And when people encountered it, they also took away not just concrete names of new entities in the world, like a data processor or a data subject. They also took away the knowledge that they could do something about the data held on them. So it didn't really start out as an educational project or a public communication of GDPR project, but there was no way of ending these parties and events without saying, now you know who a data processor is. Now you know that you can contact them and request the archive of your data, and you can request for it to be deleted. So I would say that that is a form of storytelling that puts the participant into the story, like Malavika was saying, viscerally, and it doesn't mean that they are, it's not a form of palliative storytelling. So I think there's a nice distinction to be made between the stories that are told through art, the participation that you are invited into through them, and the pejorative dimension of copium that suggests that nothing changes as a result.
I think this also reminds me that I was very remiss in saying something very, very key, which is that after the Wuhan Secrets project, yes, the exhibition was shut down in 48 hours, but the law was also changed to allow for all of the rights against do not disturb and spamming and unwanted text messages. So it did have a very real world effect in the law and policy domain.
There's a question. Nat first. Yeah. Can we have the microphone? Yeah.
Said. I want to follow up on Roger's question because I appreciated the sentiment there, but I wondered if it wasn't a false dichotomy, and not so much a question of storytelling as some sort of folksy kind of thing, as distinct from indisputable facts, which of course historically are always narrated and subject to disciplinary contestation, changing historical junctures, so on and so forth. So in other words, it's less for me a question of some distinction between cultural expression and indisputable kind of truth, of course, but rather the politics of discourse and the types of institutional conditions, social kind of relations, which attribute competing degrees of legitimacy to expression. So for me, my question to you would be, how are you kind of understanding fact here, and what sort of status does it hold?
So now the stew is getting better even among the audience.
No, and I
don't. Guest guitar solo now.
No. Which reminds me, I need to practice when I get back home. But no, I didn't want to imply in any way, that there's something pejorative about storytelling. I see storytelling as a fact, not as a judgment. Storytelling is inevitable because it is what we do, and it is all that we do. But there are different kinds of stories with different kind of functions and different kind of styles. I love expressive poetry, but I do not want the handbooks and manuals for the pilot that are going to fly my plane home to be written in expressive poetry, because it's going to probably lead to a higher degree of crashes and security risks, right? And the same thing is true with these stories. I come at very much from the perspective of a legal mind or a policy mind, someone who works very regularly with government, who respond to these stories in policy acts, which means the dedication of financial resources, human resources, and the spending of political capital, which in turn is going to have consequences. So these narratives, at least at my point of intersection with them, are not consequence-free. In fact, they might actually generate considerable risk if they lead to misperceptions about China, which they do, that then increase the chance of, conflict in any kinds of way. So I must be concerned at some point with getting the facts right, even if in our broader societies, the story about the social credit system as it was broadly told, the function is not knowing things about China. The function is palliating our engagement with, our hangover after the Libertarian Technology Party of the 90s and early 2000s. So it's a different function there, but I have to take that big story and bring it to a very specific audience with very specific needs, with actual material consequences in the world, which is quite a different context.
Yes, I think we have another question or comment from the audience.
It's kind of relatable, but it's not like a storytelling or that. It just sort of reminds me, China recently, not too recently, but last year had a new regulation on social media, especially like Weibo, you cannot misspell. So it's like in Chinese, you have so many words that sound exactly the same, but they mean totally different. And people's been using that to say what they want to say, but they're afraid of being tagged. So, or like deleted. So that's the way that they express themselves online, just saying words that sound the same, but means different. And people all know, because we all read Chinese. And so once this regulation is out and people's comments were like, guess why we misspell? Like, it's just like, kind of like, I found this interesting. It's almost like collective art activities like that, but it does have like, and before that, and then there's the regulations out, and it's not that strictly implemented, I think. People still misspell, but then the regulations out. Just like that's, I think it's interesting and it's relatable, sort of.
I think all of the Hong Kong protest movement has been organized around exactly that sort of principle, around hiding in plain sight, using language and using different levels of, meaning. And when that doesn't work, using stickers in WeChat to convey things that words don't, and different kinds of interpretation that flow from that. So that's really, really important.
Yes.
Our time is running out, so I'm just making a very quick, short comment. It's about, how art as a social technology, the history of art as being used as social technology to channel, guide the feelings, the affect, which Malavika has talked about. So thinking about the Cultural Revolution, the intensification of using the art as a social control technology, but now the de-intensification of the social credit system, for example. The contrast between the use of art by the top-down power, at the same time, the consistency and continued use of art, which is site-specific, but also culturally specific social practices and machineries being used from bottom up, and also by the people in the middle, like the academics, the artists, etc., continue to channel the emotion, the affect, whether it's awakening the affect or to intensify the affect from different perspectives, from the diaspora, but also from within the system itself. On social media, as Lu just talked about, using different codes, acronyms, pinyin, even the Martian language, etc., to channel the language, channel the discourses, the counter discourses. So, I think the significance of art continues to play in the era of ADM+S.
And the rabbit.
Exactly. Thanks. Just very short. No, thank you.
Thank you so much, Haiqin. Yeah. So if some of us still wonder what can artistic thing have effects, maybe not on society, but on ourselves. At least, yesterday morning I drank 3 coffees. Now I don't need more. Okay, a different part, I can feel a different part of my brain has been stimulated. Okay, and there's no better way to start the day than an artistic session like this. Thank you, Malavika. Thank you all our panelists and input from the room. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.